It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Friday, August 9th, 2024. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In Los Angeles, I am John Ramey. Protests overthrow the leader of Bangladesh. A new caretaker leader has been installed. A new leader for Hamas after the assassination took out the political leader last week. And Vladimir Putin tells Iran to tread lightly regarding potential responses to the killing of the late Hamas political leader, Hania. Sam Park, let's start with Bangladesh, if we can, because this is a wild and fascinating story. And just to reset, Bangladesh is the 8th most populous nation in the world. It is one of the most densely populated nations in the world. 170 million people in an area of just over 57,000 square miles. It's the 34th biggest economy. And this is the latest, according to Reuters. Nobel Peace Prize laureate Muhammad Yunus took charge of Bangladesh's caretaker government on Thursday, yesterday, hoping to help heal the country that was convulsed by weeks of violence, forcing Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina to quit and flee to neighboring India. Sam, I believe we have talked about Prime Minister Hasina before.
Yes.
Her arc as kind of a restorer of democracy and then her descent into authoritarianism, which very clearly was on display when she had her government violently crack down on protests, killing 300 protesters that were opposed to this employment quota rollback. I won't get into the weeds of it, but starting in late July, there was a policy change. It was basically kind of patronage for descendants of veterans.
Very much, yes.
And government jobs. People were outraged. 300 of them were killed, and people were additionally outraged. And eventually, she barely got out of the palace and fled to India.
Correct. So we might say there's been a shakeout.
Hey.
Anyway, now, first of all, we should apologize to our regular listeners because, as you say, this has been going on for quite some time and we haven't talked about it. Now, there have been plenty of other things that we have had to talk about, and we're only on once a week. So, perhaps we can be forgiven. But I think, and I feel a little bit better just because we're not the only ones who are surprised about how quickly this all came down. I've seen many commentators on television and in print that really didn't think that Hasina would flee the country. But thinking back on it, it's easy to see why she had to. For instance, when the civil war broke out in Sudan last year, eventually the Sudanese armed forces fled the capital, Khartoum, and have now established their base in Port Sudan on the Red Sea coast. But Sudan is a nation of 44 million people, so it's quite a lot smaller, although still plenty of people, but they have a much larger landmass. The point is, there was a place for them to go, right? If you're in a country of 170 million people on a piece of land that's as small as Bangladesh, and by the way, getting smaller all the time due to climate change, but that's a different story. There's no place for Hasina to go in the country. She had to leave. And so this all came down again over a number of weeks, but still the idea that she had to flee took many people by surprise. And so there's some question as to how things are going to go into the future. It's something we're going to have to keep an eye on going forward. But just to flesh out a little bit what happened leading up to this, the law in question that you spoke about had been sort of debated and withdrawn and proposed and then went back and forth. But eventually the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, or whatever they call the highest court in Bangladesh, I'm not sure if it's called the Supreme Court. But in any case, the judiciary of Bangladesh finally allowed this law to go forward. And it would have essentially established employment quotas for government jobs of relatives of soldiers who fought in the War of Independence in 1971. And the ruling Awami League of Sheikh Hasina, that is her political party, is essentially the successor organization of the victors of that war. And so basically it almost establishes a political caste system
Right.
inside the country that permanently favors supporters of the ruling party. And this was just a bridge too far for just an enormous number of people in Bangladesh.
If I can just point out, the quota initially called to reserve 1/3 of government jobs for the descendants of these veterans.
That's
and
right.
then the Supreme Court on the 21st of July scaled back that quota, I think, in response to some of this.
That's right. But still, right? For instance, as in many countries of the global South, the population of Bangladesh is very young, and so this idea that that the civil war of half a century ago should still be deciding who gets a government job. I mean, we've talked about the extent to which many authoritarian leaders have this weird sort of atavistic approach to governance and the culture of their country. And this is just, if you're a 22-year-old in Bangladesh, what do you really care what side of the war your grandfather fought on, right? And why that should have anything to do with what job you get? It's just ridiculous and real. I think it's disgusting in a way, right? To want to have to be dragged back into the past over and over and over again. And so in a way, it's heartening, right? Because I think a lot of people just assumed that Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League would succeed in this slow but steady drift toward, not drift, but movement towards authoritarianism. For instance, it succeeded in Hungary. It succeeded in Turkey. It succeeded in a number of other places. And I think a lot of people are just sort of becoming fatalistic about this and saying that this is just something that's happening all over the world. But apparently in Bangladesh, the people just got tired of it and rose up to arrest this movement. And perhaps we should not have been surprised, because in India, right next door, the movement towards authoritarianism of the BJP, the ruling party of the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, was defeated at the polls. Right, not defeated, but they lost their parliamentary majority. That was also a surprise to many people, right? People just sort of thought that this kind of movement towards a more authoritarian government in a democratic country would just sort of slowly continue. But it didn't happen in India, which I would say is the country most directly comparable to Bangladesh. And that election in India was only a few months ago. And we covered in the inaugural episode of our 2024 Electorama series the election in Bangladesh. That was, I believe, on the 7th of January. And it was there were many people in Bangladesh who were very disappointed about that election because it was so obviously rigged in favor of the Awami League.
So Hasina, the now, I guess, can we say deposed prime minister, had been in charge for 15 years.
Yes.
And her arc is fascinating. And let's just reset this. There's very good reporting from the New York Times, both about her fleeing at the last possible moment, because she was trying to hang on until basically like her staff said, you
got to go.
You got to go. Right. So Hasina, her dad, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, was the founder of Bangladesh. And most of their family massacred in a military coup. Hasina was out of the country at the time, and she was forced into exile in India. She eventually returns as a savior of Bangladeshi democracy and wins. But then, she was celebrated as a secular Muslim woman. This is the New York Times report, who tried to rein in a coup-prone military, stood up to Islamist militancy, and reformed the impoverished country's economy. But over the course of her 15 years now, it got more authoritarian to the point where a part of the crackdown on the 4th of August, so 5 days ago, right before she fled, Nearly 100 people were killed in one day in a police crackdown against these protesters. So that is quite the arc, quite the evolution from restoring Bangladeshi democracy to having a police force that kills nearly 100 in a day and nearly 300 during this episode of protest.
Yes, and I want to thank you for sort of fleshing out the sort of point I was making earlier, which is that Bangladesh had a flawed democracy, but there were two different parties that did alternate in power, much as they do in the United States. The problem is both of these parties are essentially family dynastic businesses. The other party traditionally was the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party, or National Party, I should say, that was run by Sheikh Hasina's great rival, Khalida Zia, who also was the heir of her party. Right, that is, her father was the head of her party until he died and handed it off to Khalida. Now, I believe Khalida's been under house arrest for a number of years now. And that's one of the reasons why the BNP boycotted the elections back in January. And she's been freed. And so the student protesters are happy that she will be taking part in the upcoming elections, or the elections that the Bangladeshi constitution mandates should take place within 90 days. There's some question as to whether that's actually going to happen. But it's not because the student protesters have any very high opinion of Khalida or of the BNP either, because they're, given the chance, they might have been just as bad as the Awami League. It's just that they understand that there need to be two parties, right? In fact, there's a hard right Islamist party that has essentially been outlawed for a number of years, but they, it seems, are going to be taking part also in the elections. The point, however, though, is that this is going to be a big job for Muhammad Yunus, who is a fascinating figure in his own right.
So he's known as, quote, the banker to the poor.
Yes.
He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 for the bank he founded for helping lift millions from poverty.
Yes, the Grameen Bank.
Yeah, micro lending. I would also like to shout out, we're shouting out elements of this kind of upheaval. Let's shout out the Bangladeshi military for so quickly installing a civilian caretaker government.
Yeah, it was a great move.
That's not a given.
No, it's not. But it's fortunate that there was somebody like Muhammad Yunus that they could turn to. It was like, who are you going to call, right? And there was a prominent, internationally respected Bangladeshi
civilian
figure, civilian that they could call on the phone, and not every country has that. Right now, of course, the Nobel Peace Prize is perhaps not all it's cracked up to be, right? And microcredit has some controversy that surrounds it. But again, Yunus is someone who's widely respected in the international community. And in fact, after I think he won the Nobel Prize in 2006, and the following year, he started sort of putting out feelers about maybe forming a political party. And this is when he got into trouble, right? Suddenly, he was being investigated by the law enforcement, and that's, charged with this and that crime, mainly just petty stuff, right? But just sort of sending him the message, maybe you don't want to do that, right? And he did back off, I think wisely for him. But the microcredit angle is also interesting in that it involves making very small loans to very poor people, right? So that they can generally start a business. For example, maybe you want to open a fruit market, like a little stall, right? But you need a large sort of, not very large, but a sort of industrial scale refrigerator, right? And
or maybe a cart.
Yeah, or something, right? But you can't afford a refrigerator, right? So someone lends you like $1,000, right? It's not very much
At a
money.
reasonable rate.
Yeah, well, that's where the trouble
Is that
starts,
okay? So
right?
that was actually my question. I know about micro lending as a concept, but that's the controversy that it's a bit exploitative.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're
I mean,
lending to
of
someone
course,
who's
like
very
any, yeah,
poor, right? And so there is a risk involved, and the idea is that you're sort of uh, collecting funds from sort of philanthropically minded investors, right? But you need to be able to offer them, uh, not you can't offer them a tiny rate of return in order to take what is a real credit risk for them, after all,
sure.
right? And so, some of these loans didn't work out. That's just the way these things happen. But the people for whom it did not work out didn't end up, having a really good time of it, as you might expect. And this was sort of new back in the early 2000s when Eunice pioneered the whole idea of microcredit.
I feel like it kind of rode on the back of the millennial kind of debt relief movement. Was that
Yes,
it?
that's very true. But also, and this is, I think, one of the most important things about it, is that it's the kind of thing that only really makes sense in a very sustained environment of low interest rates in the wealthy world. In other words, once interest rates rise here in the United States and in other wealthy countries, it's harder to find investors who are going to back this, right? Because they can get a guaranteed return that's maybe smaller, but it's guaranteed, right? So there's just a lot of money is going to be moving into, bonds in the Western world just by almost by itself. And so microcredit is not as sort of compelling an idea as it used to be.
Well, fortunately for Muhammad Yunus, he's got a new project.
Yeah, but the thing is, back in 2006 or 2007, when he was thinking about getting into Bangladeshi politics, he was like, I think like 65, 66 years old. Now he's 84. Right. This is, I mean, so I'm very happy that he's doing this. I wish him a lot of luck. It's going to be very difficult and taxing for him. And there's a whole range of opinions about whether or not elections are actually going to take place within 90 days, because part of the reason this uprising took place to begin with is that people don't trust the electoral system.
Right.
Right. So, there's a big sort of chicken egg problem here. But just to make up for our not having talked about this while it was developing, this definitely is something we're going to need to keep an eye on as the weeks progress. Not least, by the way, because a country right next door to Bangladesh, Myanmar, has been having a civil war for 2 years at least, right? And then that has caused this actually a refugee crisis inside of Bangladesh itself. And so Bangladesh already has a lot of problems.
Well, destabilization are us.
Yeah. And
right.
By the way, not just there, I mean, things are becoming destabilized all over the world.
Okay. So ostensibly, we'll have another election that we didn't anticipate.
Yes, although it might not actually be this year. It might not be part of Electorama 2024.
We'll see.
Yeah, it's possible.
Cautiously
90 days,
optimistic.
right? I mean, that would be inside of this year, but if it's longer than that, it might be next year.
Sure. Okay. And there's very good reporting in the New York Times just about the timeline and how Hasina fled under pressure, with, thousands of protesters kind of surging onto the palace. I mean, kind of French Revolutionary.
They looted the place.
Yeah,
they were in her bedroom.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Let us discuss Yahya Sinwar. Am I saying his first name correctly, Sam?
I think that's right. Yeah. I don't
so
speak Arabic, but as
sure.
far as I know, yeah.
Okay, so neither do I. Dateline Beirut, Associated Press. Hamas on Tuesday named Yahya Sinwar, its top official in Gaza, who masterminded the October 7th attacks in Israel, as its new leader, in a dramatic sign of the power of the Palestinian militant group's hardline wing, after Sinwar's predecessor was killed in what is widely understood to be an Israeli airstrike in Tehran, the capital of Iran, which we talked about last episode.
Yes, Ismail Haniyeh.
So Haniyeh, who was negotiating for the release of hostages following the October 7th attack, was killed as the political leader. And now Sinwar, a hardline militant, replaces him. And I'm sorry to be cynical, Sam, but we talked about this last week. Like, this kind of torpedoes potentially, or could be seen to have been the Israeli Defense Forces killing off somebody who is maybe more useful in coming up with a peaceful exchange of hostages, whereas this now more firmly entrenches Hamas in a militant stance.
Yes,
because there were factions within Hamas, although
yes,
all of them terrible, but not equally.
That's right. And in fact, just by coincidence, in this week's issue of The New Yorker, David Remnick wrote a lengthy profile of Sinwar. And this, of course, it was published before he was named the new leader. Although I think
it's a fascinating story.
It's fantastic. And now, of course, they didn't interview him, which, by the way, of course, would have been the scoop of the year.
No, but his biography's phenomenal. He's born in 1962 in a refugee camp in Gaza.
Yes.
He's an early joiner of Hamas, founded in 87. So he's, 25? He's a young man.
Yes, and he went to prison the next year.
And he survived brain cancer in 2008 after being treated by Israeli doctors.
Yes.
Because he was imprisoned. And then he was released, I think, 2011 as part of an exchange. Netanyahu releases him after his life has been saved by Israelis. And this guy goes on to mastermind the October 7th attack and now is the leader of Hamas.
Yes. And I'm sure that actually there are more militant people inside of Hamas than Yahya Sinwar, but neither of them is someone whose name we know. I mean, this guy's so far out. It's crazy. And it's important, I think, that people recognize this. And in a way, even though Ismail Haniyeh was titularly the leader of Hamas until last week when he was killed, as we discussed in last week's episode, Sinwar has essentially had an operational veto over any ceasefire to begin with, right? And as much as we might want to cast blame on Benjamin Netanyahu for not wanting a ceasefire, which is a justified criticism, as we've pointed out also, Sinwar didn't want one either. And so there are people in the conflict between Hamas and Israel. There are people in Hamas who would like a ceasefire, and there are people in Israel who would like a ceasefire. But none of those people are actually making the decisions. And so killing Haniyeh might not have actually made all that big a difference, because if Sinwar wasn't going to agree to a ceasefire, there probably wasn't going to be one. And so it's true, as we discussed last week, Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel in general have a history of empowering more militant Palestinians at the expense of more pragmatic Palestinians. And I think that element applies here also. But one thing we should mention is that I have to think that if Israel had gotten the opportunity to kill Sinwar before they killed Haniyeh, they would have done it. All right, there's just no question in my mind.
Right, they're not that cynical.
No, I mean, they would have totally killed him. And by the way, if they get a chance to kill him today, tomorrow, next week, next month, they're gonna do it, right? And so it's not just this, we're gonna, do this chess move and stuff. They're just gonna try and kill all these people, right? Now, that's bad for the chances of a ceasefire, right? And so I think the main outgrowth of this is that unless Sinwar is killed and or Netanyahu is deposed as the Israeli prime minister, there's just not going to be a ceasefire, right? And that's terrible. I hate having to say that, but I can't see it working out any other way. And at the moment, the Knesset, that is the Israeli parliament, is on recess for 3 months, which I was shocked to hear that they would do this. But apparently that's what happens every year in the Knesset, right? Is that August, September, October is always a recess.
Well, you got 2 sets of high holy days in there.
Yeah, okay, I get it, right? I mean, but maybe take this year off. Right. If there was a year where you weren't going to do that, I think maybe it would be this one. But the point is that until the Knesset comes back into session, Netanyahu can't be voted out in a vote of no confidence because that's the Knesset is the body that would have to do that. So he's going to be there for at least another 3 months, unless for some reason he decides to call an emergency session, right? But I don't think he would want to do that. And unless Sinwar is killed, there's nothing to be done. Now, yesterday, the governments of the United States, Qatar, and Egypt issued a joint statement urging both Hamas and Israel to come back to the negotiating table. I'm glad they did that, but the point is they had to do it because neither Israel nor Hamas was at the negotiating table at that point. And one final thing I would say about the negotiations is that for Sinwar to agree to a ceasefire, word of the negotiations might have to reach him on foot, right? Because, I mean, I guess somewhere in the tunnel network of Hamas inside of Gaza where he's holed up, there might be a cable TV connection, but, you know, it might have been destroyed or whatever, and he'd still have to, but the point is he's mainly communicating via courier. And so the speed with which you could agree to anything, you know, it'll take a few days on either end.
That's wild.
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
Just to kind of go back to his biography. So he's born in 1962 in a refugee camp in Gaza called Khan Yunis.
Khan Yunis, yes.
Okay. Israel arrests him in the late 1980s. Remember, Hamas founded in 87. So he's a young man. He's in his mid-20s. In the late 80s, Israel arrests Sinwar, and he admits to killing 12 suspected collaborators with the Israelis, a role that earns him the nickname, quote, the Butcher of Khan Yunis.
Yes.
And this is the AP story I'm reading from. He was sentenced to 4 life terms for offenses that included killing 2 Israeli soldiers. Once he's in prison, he organizes strikes to improve working conditions. He studies Hebrew. He studies Israeli society. As we mentioned, the Israeli doctors save his life after he has brain cancer in 2008. Sinwar released from prison in 2011. Netanyahu is prime minister when this exchange happens. And then when he comes back to Gaza, he rises through the ranks of Hamas with a reputation for ruthlessness. He is widely believed, again, this is the AP story, to be behind the 2016 killing of another top Hamas commander in an internal power struggle. So, like, I'm not going to take too much time to sort who's worse in Hamas than somebody else, but this is a hardline dude to be in charge.
No question about it. And it's important that people understand who it is they're dealing with. And I'm sure the Israelis have no illusions about this whatsoever, right? They've known him longer than we have. But now, I guess it's possible that he might have a sort of change of heart or adopt a more pragmatic perspective and just get tired of living underground his whole life. But he seems to be the sort of person who could tough it out for a number of years. And it's very disturbing that he's now basically in charge of Hamas, elected unanimously by, I'm not sure if they actually call it the Politburo, but that's basically what it comes down to.
All right. Why is Sinwar now in charge of Hamas? Because last week, or a little more than a week ago, Israel killed Haniya, the previous political leader of Hamas, in Tehran, Iran. Remember, Hamas is, what do we call them? A client militia of Iran?
I would say Iran is their patron. Let's put it that way.
So we've all been anticipating, dreading the what we anticipate to be inevitable Iranian response to this. And an interesting development occurred this week. This past Tuesday, according to Reuters, or reporting from Reuters, Russian President Vladimir Putin asked Iran's supreme leader, that's the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, for a restrained response to Israel's suspected killing of Haniya, the now dead former political leader of Hamas. Putin advised against attacks on Israeli civilians. This is according to two senior Iranian sources.
Yes, and
why is Vladimir Putin suddenly so concerned about civilian casualties?
well, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm loath to try and get inside his mind.
Sure, but were you anticipating Putin weighing in on this?
I wouldn't say anticipating, but we know that Iran is one of the nations that has been supplying Russia with arms for its war against Ukraine.
Drones specifically, right?
Yes, that's right. And drones were a large part of what were used in the last Iranian retaliatory attack against Israel for when Israel killed two of their Revolutionary Guard commanders in Syria. I think those sorts of airborne weapons anyway are the ones that would inflict the most civilian casualties in Israel were Iran to employ them. And so in some ways, it's just like, look, you can't keep arming us if you're using your weapons for yourself, right? And it's
not that magnanimous.
No.
It's pretty self-serving.
I think so, right? But at the same time, if you're Iran, you're like, look, we say death to Israel every day, right? It's kind of our thing. What are we supposed to do now, right? They take out a guy in our house, right? And we're supposed to say, oh, never mind. We didn't mean it when we said death to Israel every day for half a century. I'm sorry. I mean, we're not, or not half a century, four decades, I mean.
Darn near half a century.
Yeah, Sam. Just like you can have our weapons when we're not using them. Okay. How about that, Vlad? But we're going to, we'll have to see how this works out. But so far, they haven't responded. I guess at some point they will.
The same sources told Reuters that Tehran, the Iranian capital Tehran, also pressed Moscow for the delivery of some Russian-made fighter jets. This illustrates something that an expert, an author that you and I both admire quite a bit, Ann Applebaum, has written a book about. I believe the new book is Autocracy, Inc. And yes. She says it's not an axis, it's not an alliance, but it's a network of authoritarian governments that have wildly different systems, kind of as far as political philosophy go, but they are networked in support of one another, generally against Western democracy.
I think that's very astute. Yeah.
Iran and Russia are a big part of it, along with North Korea and China.
Yeah, so it seems like there might be a sort of negotiation here. Just like, okay, well, you want us to take it easy? How about some planes? Right. And so it's not that these things happen automatically. There is some give and take that needs to take place between those two parties. I think that's fascinating. Right. And it helps us, again, illustrate how this Cold War is not exactly the same as the last Cold War or for either of the world wars, for that matter.
Yeah. If you have a chance, I've not yet read Applebaum's book, but if you have a chance, anybody listening, to listen to her, as she's on a publicity tour about that book. And yes. It's fascinating. You can also lump kind of Venezuela into that, because these are countries, these are nations that are illiberal, that are interested in seeing the West and Western hegemony fall. But, there's big differences even between North Korea, China, and Venezuela, for example, the yes. three nominally communist countries that would be part of this network, right? Huge differences, to say nothing of the theocracy of Iran and the authoritarianism of Russia.
That's right. It's important that we understand that these are not all the same.
No, and it's not an alliance.
It might be, but it's
not in a military sense.
No,
it's not NATO.
That's right,
it's not the
right.
Axis powers. Or
that's exactly right.
Yeah. So we're waiting, or we're anticipating with dread an Iranian response to the attack in Tehran that killed Hania. 7 U.S. personnel were injured when 2 rockets hit Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq on Monday. That's according to a defense official. The U.S. Defense Department on Monday blamed Iran-aligned militia groups for the attack. But it hasn't really, nobody's been kind of waving the bloody shirt about Iran about this from the United States side.
And honestly, I don't think they should.
Well, right? It's because these militias, these kind of, Iran is the patron of so many different militias, right? We know the big ones, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas. But as we've talked about a lot on this podcast, there are a lot of independent actors who might take Iranian cash or supplies, but it's not like there's a chain of command.
That's right. Not necessarily anyway. And the other thing about it is that we've had troops in Iraq for 20 years. And I'm sorry, they're going to get attacked. All right. You put them on the ground, someone's going to attack them. I'm not in favor of it, but I don't know what anybody expects to happen.
So this isn't the Iranian response to Hania. This is just,
I really doubt it.
But just this is just kind of the ambient violent nature of U.S. troops being so close to Iran.
And this is not the first time this has happened since October 7th or before, right? This is, I wouldn't say it's routine, but it's certainly not unheard of.
All right, that'll do it for this week's edition of Working for Crusoe. Sam Park, we have already talked about what we want to discuss next week. In part, things could happen, but you've got the Ukrainian surge into Kursk in Russian territory in that war.
If that can be sustained. We'll have either a long conversation about it if it's sustained or a short one if it peters out.
Right. And let's put the same parameters on the anti-immigrant protests / riots in the UK, because I think we should take a little more time for that to maybe fully develop as far as what it means and what's going to happen next. All right.
And we'll get an inflation report next week also.
Oh, good. All right. He's Sam. I'm John. Have yourselves a great weekend.
Thanks, folks.